The subway screeched into the station with a metallic howl, sparks flashing against the damp New York night. Commuters froze as a shrill alarm pierced the platform. On the yellow safety strip lay a small boy, no more than 6, his skin a pale contrast to the slick tiles, his lips blue and breath too shallow. A woman in scrubs knelt beside him, pressing her hands with urgent precision against his chest, the rhythm of her compressions steady and practiced. "Call 911!" she barked, voice thin against the tunnel's echo. Instead of rushing to help, the crowd hesitated. Phones appeared, recording rather than pulling someone close to help. Whispers rose, sharp, ugly, and quick. "She's doing something to him. Maybe she took him. Call the police." The woman's dark hands moved without pause. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she whispered, giving 2 controlled breaths before resuming compressions. A transit officer pushed through, gun drawn, and shouted, "Step away from the child!" The woman's jaw tightened, but her hands did not stop. "I'm a nurse," she said, keeping her voice steady. "He's not breathing! Hands up!" the officer ordered. "If you move, we will—" "I stop! He dies!" she said, louder now. "You will have blood on your hands." Silence rippled through the crowd like a physical thing. Faces shifted between alarm and a dawning guilt. Someone muttered, "She's so calm. She must be hiding something." Another voice hissed, "Stay back. She could be dangerous." She counted silently. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. 30 again. The boy's chest rose minutely. The officer's posture wavered. A second uniformed worker reached the scene and, after a wary glance, lowered his weapon. "Wait," he said. "Let her work." Then a woman's scream cut the air, raw, desperate. A tangle of movement burst through the crowd as a woman in a rumpled coat raced down the stairs, hair wild and eyes blind with panic. She dropped to her knees beside the child, fingers frantically searching for a pulse. "Evan, my baby," she sobbed. The nurse glanced up, exhausted and raw, the lights catching at the damp hair clinging to her forehead. "Are you his mother?" she asked between compressions. The woman nodded, words choking out of her. Yes, I'm his mother. Please." The reality in the mother's eyes shifted like a shutter opening, narrowing on the woman who had saved her boy's life. "You," she whispered, the recognition slow and stunned. "You were there. You saved me at Bellevue." For a long-held breath, recognition rippled through the small ring of onlookers. This was not a stranger whose hands were to be feared. This was someone they had seen in a hospital corridor, someone who had stood between life and death. Phones dropped from hands as shame-scalded faces. The officer lowered his weapon, cheeks flushing. Paramedics arrived in a scatter of practiced motion, the world snapping back into its urgent clarity. The nurse stepped back, limbs trembling as they took over. A thin pulse flared under a medic's fingers. They placed an oxygen mask gently over the boy's face. He coughed a wet sound and blinked. The mother's face collapsed with a sound close to a laugh and a sob at once. Later, sitting on the curb with a blanket around her shoulders, the mother clutched her son close and pressed a shaking hand into the nurse's. "I don't know how to thank you," she murmured. "If you hadn't been here." The nurse's name was Monique Harris. She had left Bellevue that evening after 12 hours in the emergency department, hands raw from resuscitating strangers, heart heavy with small griefs and stubborn victories. Monique had not wanted recognition. She was used to the job's anonymity. Tonight, she wore her hospital scrubs under a thin jacket, her dark skin marked with the faint powder of antiseptic, her short curls damp from the rain. Her hands still smelled faintly of disinfectant and life. The scene had exposed a quiet, ugly truth, in the same heartbeat in which a mother's relief bloomed. There was the smear of suspicion that had fallen on Monique simply because of how she looked. People had seen a black woman on the platform and assumed the worst before they saw the action. Cameras had captured the glare and the accusation, and those frames would live long after the kid's pulse steadied. Emergency lights washed the street red and blue while Monique and the family answered questions for a detective. A woman from the crowd, cheeks stained, stepped forward. "I'm sorry," she said, voice small. "We were wrong." Monique accepted the apology with the calm of someone who had heard it before. All that matters is he's okay, she replied, keeping her tone clipped, directing the conversation back to the child's well-being. The mother's name was Emily Saunders. 3 years earlier, Monique had been the nurse on duty when Emily nearly bled to death during childbirth. Monique had stood beside the operating table as the doctors worked, holding Emily's hand and refusing to leave until the crisis subsided. The memory of that night clung to both of them like a thin scar. Emily never forgot the steadiness of Monique's voice, the way she had anchored panic into procedure. Tonight, the script had reversed. Monique had been the steady hand once more. News travels differently now. An onlooker's shaky video, initially posted with a caption suggesting the worst, began to spread. Within hours, the clip had been viewed thousands of times. Comment threads filled with anger, then confusion, then remorse. "Thank God she knew CPR," one user wrote. "They almost let her be taken away," another said. The bitter aftertaste of reality on display. Monique's phone buzzed relentlessly with messages, some from colleagues checking in, some from worried friends, and a stream of unfamiliar numbers offering gratitude. She felt exhausted in a way that sleep would not fix. The physical fatigue of compressions had been a small price compared to the emotional drag of living. In a city that reflexively mistrusted her, that night she took the subway home with the small boy's fate settled and Emily's insistence that she accept dinner with the family. They exchanged numbers. Emily pressed a paper cup of hot tea into Monique's hands before they parted. "You don't owe me anything," Emily said softly. "But if you let us, we'd like to take care of you tonight. You saved our son's life." Monique wanted to refuse. She was proud of her independence, but she accepted. She rode to Emily's modest apartment, the city's neon blur slipping past the train windows. The home smelled of lemon, and Evan slept fitfully on the couch, his small chest rising under a thin blanket. Emily made sure Monique ate. The conversation moved from medical details to the small human things, like favorite foods and the best coffee shop on 125th. When Monique told Emily that she'd been a nurse for a decade, Emily's eyes filled with gratitude that felt older than the night. "You learn to breathe through other people's panic," Monique said, stirring her tea slowly. "You take steady breaths so they can borrow them." She described nights of endless traumas and the quiet victories that made it worth staying, in a job that demanded everything. During dinner, a local news segment about the subway incident played on Emily's phone. Clips ran and comments poured in. Praise for Monique's skill, regret for the crowd's hesitation, and a handful of voices trying to justify the initial fear. One comment accused the transit officer of overreacting. Another blamed a city that had taught people to be suspicious of strangers. The conversation smelled of the city itself, vibrant, merciless, and surprisingly honest. Monique slept on the couch that night, waking early to rain slicking the sidewalks. She walked to the hospital in her scrubs, coffee in hand, letting the city fold into its familiar rhythms. At Bellevue, she treated new emergencies with the same calm efficiency. The hospital was a place where life and grief passed in turns and the work remained the same. But the social media ripples did not die. The shaky clip that once suggested danger had been recut into praise reels, op-eds, and heated message boards. People debated the officer's response and the public's willingness to film rather than act. The city argued in comment threads and water cooler conversations, and out of that argument came a small, practical shift. Dozens of people signed up for CPR classes at local community centers, a ripple of competence where suspicion had once been default. An editor from a local paper called Monique a week after the incident. "We want to tell the whole story," he said. She hesitated. Publicity felt dangerous and exposing, but Emily's quiet insistence echoed, "You saved him. You did not do this for praise." There was a larger truth here. People needed to see how bias could become a life-or-death obstacle. The article ran with a photograph of Monique on the platform, hands mid-compression, face set in concentration. The city read it hungrily. Letters to the editor and comment sections filled with reflections, some shameful, some buoyant. A community group reached out, inviting Monique to speak at a forum about emergency response and the ways bias interferes with help. She agreed reluctantly at first, then with the steady conviction of someone who had watched fear almost kill a child. At the forum, her voice was plain and direct. She spoke about the clock of CPR, how minutes stretch and the heart's fragile beat can be the thin line between life and death. She spoke about how training laypeople could save lives, how to move from hesitation to action, and how a city that assumed competence would be safer than one that assumed danger. Assume competence, she told the audience. Assume care. If you hesitate, you might cost someone everything. A young woman in the back rose, her eyes rimmed with red. I filmed because I was afraid, she admitted, voice trembling. I thought recording would protect me. Monique nodded. Fear is real, she said. But when fear is the first response and not the last, it becomes poisonous. The room held a silence that felt like a promise. Months later, the story was quieter in the headlines but louder in practice. More people carried the knowledge of compressions and breaths. The Transit Authority issued new guidance about assessing good faith responders, and some precincts reviewed their protocols for drawing weapons in ambiguous medical emergencies. It was imperfect, incremental, but real. Monique still woke sometimes with the memory of a small blue face on the platform. Other nights she dreamed of a city where people stepped forward first. She kept working, steady and uncelebrated, finding the same small victories. The child who went home, the grateful family who brought cookies to the ER, the nurse who taught a neighbor to do compressions. When Emily and Evan returned months later, Evan raced to Monique and hugged her knees. You saved me, he said solemnly, as if pronouncing a verdict. Monique laughed softly and picked him up, feeling the lift of that sentence in her bones. So you'll tell people? She asked with a smile. He nodded fiercely. Yeah, we'll tell everyone. Together we'll amplify these voices, demand change, and ensure no one hesitates when lives depend on immediate compassion. Anywhere, anytime, starting now today.